Welcome to the Floor Mobile World Congress 2024. The theme of the interview today is In the Digital Sea, APIs are the key. And I have two heavyweights in our industry with us here. We have Ishwar Parulkar, who is the CTO of Edge in Telco at AWS, and Savinay Berry. He's our EVP of Engineering Products at Vonage. So let's dive into this straight, gentlemen. So you have had amazing announcement on the run-up to MWC, great demos here. Talk us through what is the pioneering work you've been presenting and why does it matter to the industry?
Yeah, I think APIs that give access to telco networks is a really big added capability for developers. In the cloud, we've been developing all our technology, but all of that is offered through APIs and consumed through APIs. So we welcome this as a new capability that we can provide our developers to write network-aware, network-enhanced applications. Mm-hmm. So we are very excited about that. And what we're seeing at this Congress is channel partnerships, right? Where telcos can expose these APIs to various channels and really get them in the hands of developers. So I think that's very exciting.
And this is where you really have the ecosystem, where you really like the channel is your bread and butter in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, these are our customers. We have continuously over the years given them more capabilities, more services, more APIs to build more interesting applications. And this just becomes a completely new set, which wasn't available before. So we're very excited about getting that into the hands of our developers.
Right. From your angle.
Just building on that, I mean, if you think about it, go back 20 years, what do you need as a developer? You need just three things: compute, storage, network.
Okay.
That's it.
Yeah.
It's all the three things you need.
Yeah.
20 years ago, when you were trying to build something and you were trying to go access like a 16 gig storage block or a 20 gig or compute cluster, which at that time probably was still sitting in the middle of 1.5 gigahertz or something like that for compute and some very small amount of RAM. How did you do that? You literally had to go and create sometimes an invoice and then be able to access that. And that took a long time going back and forth and setting up your initial instance to do any kind of work, sometimes took days. Well, what happened? Over the last 20 years, AWS and the others, they basically created a whole industry of completely deconstructing compute and storage and creating services on top of that. And that's what created the innovation that we've seen in the last 20 plus years. And in the process, created trillions of dollars in value. That hasn't happened on the network. The network is still very much a black box. It's still very much, I mean, if you think about it as a network, if you're a developer, you'll be thinking about VPN, MPLS, or if you're looking at it as a corporate network, you'll think about an SDN. You will never really think about what are the services you can access from the network, which can be useful to build my own application. In fact, most developers build applications despite the network. And they try to create applications to compensate for the fact that they don't understand the services in the network. So that's changing now.
Right.
The network is completely getting what I call the Pandora's box is opening up. Yeah. And now you can have the same exact set of services which were created in compute storage for the last 20 years, now getting exposed to the network, of course, through APIs, because that is still programming interface for building anything. And I think we're excited about what we can do together on that.
And in terms of future roadmap, I mean, so gentlemen, what's in the pipeline, if you can talk about this? Something exciting, really, turning the tables, now making it happen, not despite the network, but really leveraging the network. Anything there where really Ericsson, Vonage, AWS come together next 12 months, 24 months?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about this developer community is you can never predict how creative they can get. Yeah. And my favorite example is the iPhone, iPhone SDK. When it opened up, I don't think anybody imagined the type of applications that could have been built on the iPhone when the SDK was open, right? So the key here is to put it in the hands of the developers, get it out there, and they will tell you, they will become creative and create all kinds of applications. But we are already seeing early signs of some areas where this will have a big impact, right? So together we announced the anti-fraud solution, right? So that's a great classic area where we are already seeing traction and interest from financial services, banks. We have a vertical focused on financial services, and we're seeing interest in those type of applications. Video media related is another category where there are compelling use cases and applications even today. We have a suite of services for manipulating video and streaming video on AWS, and that could use something like the Qode APIs to create even richer experiences for the end users who are looking or consuming videos that are transcribed, transcoded through those services that we have. So that's another big area. Location happens to be another where we already have quite a few interesting applications coming up with autonomous vehicles, drones, and general asset tracking. We have a big retail supply chain business. We do a lot of tracking of little things, packages to trucks to everything. And location APIs can help with a lot of the applications that are there in that whole supply chain.
And there I can see 5G really playing a pivotal role. I'll come back to the demand in a moment. I know something if you want to.
Yeah, so I think let's first maybe remind everybody what we announced.
Yeah.
So what we announced together with AWS and Ericsson Vonage was a really compelling fraud solution. Now you might think that fraud is, who cares? Trust me, it is one of the most difficult problems to solve at scale in the industry. And it costs businesses hundreds and billions of dollars every single year in fraud. So, and that could be fraudulent transactions, it could be smishing, it could be phishing, it could be a lot of different types of fraud. So what we announced together was kind of coming together of two really cool technologies. Now, this technology is in the service of a use case, right? So AWS Bedrock, AWS Recognition, Bedrock being the AI capabilities, and then Recognition being the facial recognition. Combining that with SIM-Swap, which is a network API that we introduced, along with number verification, which is also another API, that network API, pull it all together into a fraud solution, which provides the same exact channels, the number of channels. So you can have a biometric way to validate whether it's the same person or not. You can validate if somebody's SIM was swapped, so you know if that was a fraud signal. Or you can validate the phone number and correlate that phone number with the actual device, with the IMSI and the SIM number. So combine all of that together, suddenly you have a package which is really enterprise grade. And that didn't exist before, right? You only had these biometric channels which were available for you on a phone or something like that. But democratizing that completely for a big insurance company, for a finance company, which is looking for a solution like this, that's not easy to do. So I think that's where you have the best of both worlds kind of coming together, and the network, right? So you have the network in this case coming through with the SIM-Swap capabilities, which were there. They were sitting somewhere behind the network, going back to that. It was a black box. Now they're exposed to a service, not just a service, they're exposed to a service with a use case, which is applicable in one of the most fundamental issues that exists today, which is fraud.
And as CTOs, I think the big question to you guys is then, are you going to go really deep on that use case, or are you going to start to fawn out and kind of come up with new 12 cases, right? So next 12 to 24 months, is it really like, let's get fraud really sorted and let's think, what's going to be the next surface of attack and already provide a solution? So how do you take as CTOs on that?
I think it's early to see where the traction will be, how the money will flow, and where the really revenue potential is. But these three areas that I mentioned earlier, right? Fraud, banking, financial services, where there's authentication, identity detection kind of tasks needed to be done, is one area. The Qode with media is another area, and location is a third area, which I see getting traction in the next year. There's a lot more APIs and a lot more stuff to be done, but that will take some time till we see some adoption of these first APIs and where we already see value.
The thing that really excites me, and in some ways it's sort of the holy grail of the network, is Qode.
Yeah, absolutely.
Think of what happened, again, going back to compute and storage. I'm going to keep going back to that.
Quality on demand, by the way.
Quality on demand. Think of what happened in computer storage. When did things take off? Things took off in compute when you created a slice. And there was a setup of, you had hypervisors came in, and then you had VMs, and then you had containers, and then there was a way to dynamically scale the load up or down. You didn't have to have a static set of images or even clusters that you were able to go access. And in doing so, the capacity was something that was commensurate with the demand, and the business models worked much better. So you don't have to lay out, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of compute somewhere as to plan for peak capacity. You didn't have to do that. It was more about slicing it and doing dynamic scaling up or down. Same thing exists in theory in the network today. There is actually 3GPP standards which define that. There's even in 5G, there's a 5QI priority standard which defines exactly the packet type that you can do. How do you take that and really productize it so that end to end you can create a slice which can then go across to the end user, to the developer experience, which says, I don't care how I'm getting that slice. All I know is I'm just calling my app and I'm calling an API, which I can then configure based on the time of the day of the week. And I can just create the right capacity. On the back end, the network is the one which is creating that capacity, right? So that end-to-end view of QO, quality on demand, if we do that, end of story. Game over.
Yeah. And the key there is the consumption models behind it. So if you look at what we were able to do with compute, we created a whole bunch of consumption models. There's on demand. So you use compute when you need it. You don't, you give it up when you don't, and you don't pay for it. We have reserved, which you can reserve capacity for 3 years. You get it at a discount because we're getting committed workloads. You can give it up after 3 years. And then we have another model, which is like Spot, which is we give it at very discounted rates, but you take it away at a minute's notice. And surprisingly enough, a lot of developers are okay with that. I'm like 90% discount. I'm okay. You just take it away whenever you want to. And I see the same parallel in networks with QoD, right? I think the business models, the consumption models, the way you can price these resources and the way they can be consumed changes dramatically.
Yeah, I meant to ask you actually, how do you see 5G as part of your industry vision? But I think you answered that. You're really enthusiastic about it. So let me ask just a simple question. Are there any frustrations? Is there anything we as an industry, we need to help you with 5G? Anything we can do from an Ericsson point of view?
So from my perspective, we just talked about QoD. I think that's one of the most compelling APIs. That's where a lot of the monetization is going to happen. But the industry is very behind in really deploying, implementing, and getting the best out of it or the most out of it. There's talk about it. There's some operators have announced QoD and slicing. The standards support it, but there's a lot of nuances to really getting it right. Because once you start giving a little bit of control over the network, you need to manage provisioning. You need to manage how others are handled and things like that. It's not just about developing that API. And I think it's a mindset change. It takes a little change of looking at networks differently. The way networks have evolved, it's assumed that they will be provisioned a certain way with certain capacity, guaranteeing everybody that they will get what they want, right? No, you need to change that mindset, and that takes time. So my frustration, if you may call that, is that it's taking time to get the slicing, the QoD parts, which have been defined in the specs, into real networks. So I'm waiting for that to come in full force.
And I think the risk profile is a little different as well, because I've looked at this problem. Trust me, from the outside in, I don't come from the telco world, right? So I came in and I'm like, okay, why is this taking so long? What's going on? So it's really about the risk profile. If you think about, again, going back to compute and storage for a second, in terms of how the scale happened, where the deployments were mostly regional first, and then the capacity was determined, and then and there were so many outages that happened and on the way to getting to the scale that we've gotten to now. An outage in a network, the risk for that is probably 100 times higher because you bring down the network for the entire country, not for a company, not for an enterprise, but for the entire country. The risk for that is so much higher. And that's one of the reasons why, if you look at planning for peak capacity or even exposing, we announced a partnership with Deutsche Telekom last year, and that was something we worked with them quite a bit on, enabling QoD as an API. And again, the question on the table was, how do we do it in a more mature and organized way so we're not creating risk for the rest of Germany, literally bringing down the network for that. So I think there is going to be some of that has to be overcome. And ultimately, somebody's going to have to take a chance, and somebody will. We're getting very close to that point where we're starting to expose this. And as soon as that happens, you're going to start to see that getting used in a bunch of different applications.
Take off. Yeah, and I think, we prepared the network, so we have decoupled hardware from software. Ericsson took a big leap of faith. We acquired 1Edge, and, we kind of told the ecosystem we're serious about this. Operators need to upgrade to a 5G SA to really make this happen, and we're pushing very hard. Trust us. So hopefully, next 12 to 24 months really take off. So just to finish, maybe a side question. Gen AI, I cannot not ask a question question without having you two here. Gen AI. So Jensen said, not even 6 months ago, by the end of this decade, we will have content generated just right in the phones. And what's the impact on networks, on cloud? Do you believe in that? What's your view on this?
So, yeah, we believe this is one of the biggest transformational moments in technology in a long time. It's going to affect pretty much every application and everything that we do. And Gen AI is just a step in the evolution of AI and machine learning. That's the one thing to recognize first. There's stuff that was done before, which is also super powerful and can do a lot. But this takes it to a next level. I think it's going to also change infrastructure and technology in all aspects. So it's not just client devices and having things on the on your phones and end devices. You have to train models. Large language models. That's all happening in the cloud. You have to move data from the devices or from edge locations to the cloud in terms of when you're training and doing inference. So there's going to be an increase in compute as well as network bandwidth required across the infrastructure. So as a cloud player, we see that really changing a lot of the things we do in a significant way in terms of how we build compute, how we build our backbones, how we build our edge cloud, and so forth. So it's going to affect, I think, pretty much all aspects of infrastructure.
Yeah. In a growth way, right?
In a growth way.
I like that. Yeah. Okay. What about you?
I think take a look at what happened with Vision Pro that just got announced, right? I mean, that device it's a cool device, but it's almost as big as one of those block phones that existed 25 years ago. So imagine carrying that thing along with you. So for that to be meaningful, it's going to have the form factor for those kind of devices is going to have to be a lot smaller. And if it's a lot smaller, that means a lot of that compute which sits inside the device itself is going to have to go somewhere. Where is it going to go? It's going to have to go potentially in the network, and then potentially combine that with some of the capabilities with the large language models. Large language models are not going to run on their own. They're not going to run on the edge either directly because of the capacity that's required for what you want to do. So infrastructure, network, and then you have the devices, which are a lot more smaller form factor, more flexible, that you can carry with you. So I think that's where some of this can go.
Awesome. Jensen, I think we hear you, but we believe there's a lot of room for us networks and cloud infra. So, gentlemen, to close off, if we were to retake this interview in 2025, a year from now, what do you want us to achieve in the next 12 months?
I thought you were going to talk about the next 10 years. Let's start with
you're API native. You should deliver quickly,
I like that.
So what's your view? 12 months.
No, look, I think we're going to continue to see a lot more momentum on what I would call, I'm calling the supply side of the network API ecosystem, where you're almost creating a critical mass of supply across multiple operators in multiple regions globally. And we're already seeing it in Mobile World Congress right now. We had a bunch of announcements with Vodafone, with Verizon, with AT&T, with Telefonica, Orange. I mean, the list is going to keep growing because this is going to become that big wave which creates the supply. And once you have that across the board, across all the regions, across the world, then I think you're going to start to see the demands show up as well in terms of actual use cases that we were discussing. Because that's what people are waiting for. I mean, large organizations worldwide are not going to wait to see, I only want this part of the country in this region. It's going to have to be global. So I think by next year, you're going to see that global map fill out a lot more. And as a result of that, you're going to start to see demand for a lot of these use cases start to show up. And my personal goal is finally cracking that QOD nut to a real use case end to end, that we can totally drive this forward.
Let's do this. Ishwar, what about you?
Yeah, so I agree with everything Savanya said, right? I mean, we have the supply side, kind of getting in motion now. On the adopter side, there's some education to be done. I think one of the key things we need to do is really help the developers understand what these things can do, because it's a different world completely, right? Networks and what happens underneath, because that's not been done before. So they need to understand that. Yeah. So again, not to belabor the point, but QOD is the big example, right? But QOD, it doesn't, in this community here, we understand what it means. You don't even have to explain what QOD means. But even when you say quality on demand, it doesn't mean anything to a developer today, right? So what does it really mean?
It shouldn't mean anything to them. It almost will be like you shouldn't have to care about what this even means to you.
Exactly. But for them to understand what that gives you takes, there's going to be some education about that, right? So, and I'm taking that as an example, but in general, some of the other things as well. So, the consumer side of this equation, where developers start using this, there's some work to be done in terms of getting some traction in the field, putting out the APIs, educating them about how these APIs can be used, creating some use cases, applications, reference architectures that they can build on. So I think that's the work ahead for us in this year.
I love it. So, I mean, the message is create supply over the next 12 months. Educate the ecosystem. We will convince our customers to roll out 5G to really provide global consistency, because this is really what you need for the dev ecosystem and for all the applications we'll be using that. And hopefully this time next year, we will have cracked the nut and demand will really take off. Thanks so much, gentlemen. That was fascinating insights. And if you're watching this post-Mobile Congress, check all the fantastic proof points we have delivered here on the Ericsson booth to support the vision we have just been discussing. Thank you, and out and over from Mobile World Congress. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.